Well, this weekend is our missions conference, and yesterday we had a good time with Mike Picconato. He was here at 3 in the afternoon sharing things with us about the work in Germany, all very interesting. And then we all went over to feed my starving children, including Mike. And then this morning Mike shared again in Sunday school. Mike and Alyssa Picconato have been serving as international workers with the Christian and Missionary Alliance in Berlin, Germany. They've been leading a ministry center/art gallery with the purpose of trying to connect with Germans and people of different cultures, and also artists. Mike and Alyssa started their ministry in Maple Plain, Minnesota, serving there in youth ministry from 1996 to 2002. And then from there they moved to Staples, Minnesota, where Mike served as the senior pastor for about 10 years. And then in 2012, the family moved to Berlin, Germany, where they now serve as international workers. They are on home assignment right now, and it's really a privilege to have them with us. And I do have a special interest in Germany because my wife and I are both full-blooded Germans, and our ancestors moved from Germany to Russia, and then they came from Russia. My grandparents were about 10 years old when they came to the United States. And we grew up in north central South Dakota with a very German community. And so the first language I learned to speak as a child was German. And I was probably about 4 years old when I started speaking English. I had to start getting ready for school. But anyway, and I don't know how you say Kirche in High German, but in Low German, we say church. In Low German, we say Kirche. And that means church. And the sign out there says, "Welcome to the church." And I remember my parents saying it's time to go to Kirche when I was a little boy. So anyway, join me in welcoming Mike.
So in High German, you would say Kirche. And High German doesn't mean better German. It just means region of the country. It's not high-low from an education point of view. It's just a regional aspect. And so it was encouraging for me to see Willkommen in der Kirche as I came in last night. It's such a privilege for me to be able to be here. I really enjoy, being able to, on a monthly basis, see, you guys may not know this, but each month we receive a list of donations from the Christian Missionary Alliance. They send it to us via email, and then we can know who's been supporting us and who has been giving gifts to us in each month. It's been such an encouragement to see Word of Life Alliance Church on the statement that we received, and we're so grateful for the support that you guys have given to our family, and knowing that you're supporting other workers. And as I shared last night, knowing that comes not just with financial gifts, but knowing that there are people in your church that are also praying for us and praying for our ministry. My family wasn't able to join me today. My daughter, 17 years old on the far left in the picture up there. And then my son Caleb is 14 in the back. And then Joshua, his birthday today, he's turning 12 today. But Johanna was in a theater production. And of all things, this was the weekend that the performances took place. So Thursday night, Friday night, and Saturday night were the performances. And because Joshua's birthday is today, there's family staying over at our house. I'm grateful to be here. And I love my family, and I'll be joining them for the closing of birthday celebrations. After we're done today, I'll drive back up and be able to celebrate with them as well. And Alyssa, of course, is not another daughter. It's my wife in the middle standing next to me. One of the great privileges that we have of being a part of the Christian Missionary Alliance is knowing that the Alliance is part of this amazing family of churches. And you might not know this, but every Sunday or every weekend, there are more than 2,000 Alliance churches that meet. About 500,000 Alliance worshipers in the United States that worship Jesus in 37 different languages and dialects. That's within the United States. Worldwide, there are more than 6 million people that say that they're part of the Alliance family in 93 different countries. And as an alliance, as an American U.S. Alliance family, you guys are part of supporting, as Orville said, more than 700 Alliance workers that are serving the Lord in more than 70 different languages. As I was coming out of college and trying to decide which denomination do I want to serve with, where do I want to work, one of the things that really attracted me to the Christian Missionary Alliance was the way the Alliance does missions. And I love the way that in the Alliance, we're not an organization that has a missions program. We're a family of churches that recognizes that there are some big things that God wants to do in the world. And that when we come together, we can see God accomplish some amazing things that this Acts 1:8 family can accomplish as we do things together. That we can reach Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth as God brings us together to do that. And so it's such an encouragement for me to be able to be a part of your church family this morning and to hear about the Celebrate Recovery Ministry and to serve with you yesterday at Feed My Starving Children and know that while we're reaching where God has called us to the uttermost parts of the earth, this congregation is reaching Jerusalem and Judea here in Coon Rapids. So thank you for being a part of that Alliance family. We're going to take a look at a passage of Scripture this morning in 1 Peter chapter 2. And if you have your Bibles with you, you can turn to those. 1 Peter chapter 2. I'm going to read verses 4 through 12. And I'm going to read from the Holman Christian Standard Bible. It'll be on the screen if you're not familiar with that. But I'm going to be looking at one word in particular in verse 9. And in the King James Version, that one word is this word peculiar. You may be seeing it on the posters, this idea of peculiar people. And maybe you thought, why on earth is the Alliance talking to us about being strange, about being peculiar? Because that's the way we use the word now. But when Peter was writing, when King James English was being the language that Peter's writing for being translated into, that word peculiar meant set apart for God, God's own particular people. And so when we take a look at the passage today, we'll realize that God is talking to us in two ways, I believe. First of all, that Peter is saying, you are God's own special set apart people. But the reality is that in the world we live in today, when we're God's own set apart people, that often makes us strange as well. So both definitions of the word apply. Let's read the passage together. It says, coming to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but chosen and valuable to God. You yourselves, as living stones, are being built into a spiritual house for a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it's contained in Scripture, look, I lay a stone in Zion, a chosen and honored cornerstone. And the one who believes in him will never be put to shame. So honor will come to you who believe. But for the unbelieving, the stone that the builders rejected, this one has become the cornerstone, and a stone to stumble over, and a rock to trip over. They stumbled because they disobeyed the message. They were destined for this. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his possession, peculiar people, so that you may proclaim the praises of the one who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people. Now you are God's people. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as strangers and temporary residents to abstain from fleshly desires that war against you. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that in a case where they speak against you as those who do what is evil, they will, by observing your good works, glorify God on the day of visitation. We give you a little bit of historical context to the passage. Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 1 that he's writing to the dispersed Jews that are scattered throughout the Roman Empire. And this scattering of the Jews started in Acts chapter 7 and 8. In Acts chapter 6, Stephen is chosen among the group of deacons, first deacons in the church. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen is also seen as an evangelist. He's proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. Some people weren't so appreciative of his message. They arrest him. They haul him before the Jewish leaders to give a defense of himself. And he preaches an amazing evangelistic message in Acts chapter 7. One of the longest evangelistic messages you'll read in all of the Bible. At the end of it, he calls his listeners stiff-necked. They didn't appreciate that so much. They also didn't appreciate the message itself. And so they executed Stephen. They picked up rocks and they threw them at Stephen until he was dead. And in Acts chapter 8, we read, verse 1 says, "And on that day, severe persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. And all except the apostles were scattered throughout the land of Judea and Samaria." And the Jewish Christians then continued to disperse until they were scattered throughout the Roman provinces. And Peter's writing to them. He's writing them for many reasons, one of them being that he needs to remind them of their true identity. He writes to them and he says, "I urge you as strangers and temporary residents." That's how they were feeling. But that's not really who they were. Their identity isn't scattered people. Their identity is God's chosen, God's royal, holy, and special people. And God has sent them for a purpose into the worlds that they're now living in. And in verse 12, Peter encourages them to conduct themselves honorably among the Gentiles. So that even if they're accused of doing something wrong, people might see their good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. So the question for us is, how do we live our lives as God's holy and royal and chosen and set apart people? The first way we do that is we recognize that there is an amazing provision that has been made for us. And this provision for us is a precious identity that we have in Christ. The Jewish people throughout the Old Testament were used to identifying themselves as God's chosen people. And as they identified themselves as these people set apart for God, this identity often rooted itself in religious traditions. And these religious traditions were often grounded in a geographical location. Many of them took place in the city of Jerusalem. But that's not the case for them anymore. Now they're scattered. Now instead of being able to go to the Temple Mount, they're surrounded by pagan temples. Instead of being able to go and buy clean food in the marketplace, they're surrounded by unclean foods. The traditions that are all around them are completely different traditions than the ones that they're used to. And if your identity is grounded in traditions, especially in religious traditions, it can become very unsettling when those traditions are changed. And they needed to be reminded who their foundation really is. The foundation isn't the temple. The foundation is the cornerstone. And Peter goes to Isaiah and to the Psalms and reminds them that this cornerstone is Jesus and that they are being built into a spiritual house. And he's telling them, you are not without a foundation. He reminds them that they're a chosen people, but then takes them deeper. And he needed to. Because the Jewish recipients of Peter's letter were much like we are sometimes. We become very short-sighted and miss that God has chosen us to also be a blessing to other people. Sometimes we begin to view God's love as our possession. We begin to be arrogant in the separation, the difference between us and the world around us. So Peter quotes to them from the prophet Habakkuk. And it reminds them that they also were once not God's people. And now they are God's people. They were once those who were not loved, but now are loved. That they are people that God has called out of darkness into his marvelous light. And this is even a greater comfort than being called God's chosen people. Now they are people who are impacted by God's amazing and overflowing mercy. They're God's precious possession. And I hope that we this morning can see the difference, because we are not people who were chosen by birthright. We are not people who are God's people because we follow his rules. We are people that God has chosen. We are precious people. And our identity in Christ doesn't come from our works. It doesn't come from our heritage. We are precious to God because he chose to show us his mercy. It means that what we do for him can only come from love and gratitude. And our identity is found in our relationship with him, not in a duty of serving him. And this position of being deeply loved by God, this precious identity in him, changes our lives. And Jesus' death on the cross to forgive our sins and to restore our relationship with God is a testimony to how great God's love is for us. Now, why is this so important? This is so important because the foundational motivation for serving God's purposes is knowing that we are loved by him. We know this is important because any of us who have tried to serve God out of a sense of duty or obligation, or because someone else has told us that we need to, or has pulled us into a ministry and we're only serving because we have to, realize that it's not long before it's not fun for us anymore, before we begin to burn out, before that ministry feels exhausting, before we're finding no joy, before Sunday morning rolls around and we think, is it Sunday already again? But when we serve out of love for him, when we recognize how our life has been impacted by love for him, when the duty, the service that we do for God is not rote ritual or duty, but it's an overflowing love for him that brings us joy, it fills our spirits, it recharges us, and we find that we might be tired at the end of it, but it's a good time. And the foundational motivation for missions is overflowing love for the one who first loved us. Let me tell you the story of two friends of mine, Mike and Doris Reicher. Mike is a really neat guy. Mike just had his 50th birthday party last year. So Mike was in his early 20s when the Berlin Wall came down. Raised in East Berlin, Mike would have had to serve mandatory military service, guarding the Berlin Wall or serving the East German government somewhere. Mike wasn't a believer, but he also didn't support the East German communist government, and so he decided he was not going to serve his mandatory military service. That had amazing implications for Mike's life, not in a good way. That meant that Mike had to go into hiding, because if he wouldn't have been into hiding, they would have shown up at his house and arrested him. It meant that Mike could not go to school because he could not show that he had served his mandatory military service. It meant that Mike was also unemployable in a traditional form of the word. And so when the wall came down, Mike, now in his early to mid-20s, is uneducated, unemployable, and married to Doris. In fact, just a few years ago, Mike finally went back to school and completed his education that he was not able to complete because of the East German government. Married to Doris, the wall is down. They're living in an area of the city called Picconatto, former area of East Berlin. And they have a child, and Doris one day at the end of her ropes as a parent, not really sure what to do, is pushing her daughter through the streets of former East Berlin and comes to this old church, the Picconato Evangelical Church in former East Berlin, and there's a church service taking place. And Doris hears singing coming from the church, and so she pushes her baby with the baby stroller into the entryway of the church and just listens to the music and then listens to the message. And then after the service is over, people come and greet her and welcome her. And this is the beginning of Doris's journey from non-believer to believer. And as Doris makes these steps and then becomes a follower of Jesus Christ, she then becomes a part of a transformational, life-changing, disciple-building small group movement in Germany. And the small group movement said, we really want to start a Christian events cafe in your part of the city. It had already been started, actually, but Doris and Mike, we want you guys to take over the leadership of this as new believers. And Mike and Doris have been leading this Christian Events Cafe for more than 20 years now. The Events Cafe just celebrated their 25th anniversary, and Doris will tell anyone that will listen that she views her ministry as part of this Events Cafe in East Berlin, former East Berlin. She'll say, Mike, so she's told me, Mike, I am a lifeboat in a sea, in a river of lost and drowning people. And my mission in life through the work of the cafe is to snatch as many drowning souls out of the river into the lifeboat and bring them to shore where I can connect them with churches that can help them grow in their faith. And each year, Doris has the opportunity to share the good news of Jesus with hundreds, if not thousands of people. And over the years, the Alliance has partnered with Mike and Doris and the cafe, and Doris has given me strict orders, one of the most intense people I've ever met, and said, Mike, whenever you speak to Alliance churches, tell them thank you for their partnership with us. Multiple times a year, I meet with Doris and pray with her, and often one of those prayer meetings takes place in between New Year's and the end of January. And Doris and I will share our goals for the year. We'll pray for each other. Last year's goal for Doris was, I just want to continue to grow closer to Jesus. Because Doris doesn't share the good news of Jesus because she feels obligated. She shares the good news of Jesus because she's been so transformed by the love of Christ that she wants that to continue to overflow from her to the people around her. She knows what it's like to be lost. And she knows what it's like to be found. And this precious identity that she has in Jesus overflows to others. And that's how it should be for us as well. The love of Jesus should overflow out of us because we are God's precious, chosen children. Second thing I want to talk about, how can we live these peculiar lives, is we can live these peculiar lives because God has a special purpose for us. And the special purpose is that we are priests. He's given us a priestly ministry between God and the peoples of the world. In verse 9 he says, you are a royal priesthood. He tells us we're like living stones that are being built into a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God. So what is a priest's job? What is the role of a priest? A priest's job is to serve as an intermediary. He brings the words and the messages of God to the people that God has called him to. And then, these people that God has called him to, he's also constantly bringing them back before the throne of the Father. He stands in the middle. And Peter writes that we are a royal priesthood. He also tells us that we're living stones being built into a house. Now this would have, for Peter's Jewish recipients, invoked imagery of the temple. And maybe you remember when, maybe not personally, but maybe you remember reading of when Jesus went into the temple in the city of Jerusalem. And he noticed that the temple was filled with people who were selling sacrifices at these highly inflated prices. And it makes Jesus incredibly angry. And he chases them out and he tells people, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. This house, this temple that God had in Jerusalem was not just for the Jewish people. It was to be a house of prayer for all nations. And the house, the spiritual house that God is building us into, is also to be a house for all nations. In the Alliance, we look at it as the bookend promises of Scripture. If you go to Genesis chapter 12, you see that God comes to Abraham and says to Abraham, your seed, your descendant, will be a blessing to all nations. And then, if you go to the end of the book, if you go to Revelation, in Revelation chapter 7, we see that the Apostle John has this vision where he's standing with this crowd of people dressed in the white robes of salvation before the throne of God, and he describes these people as being people from every tribe and nation, every tongue. From the beginning to the end of the Bible, God's heart has always been for people of all nations. And the Alliance's vision and mission when it comes to missions can be summarized in 7 words: that we want to provide gospel access for and from all people. What that means is that whenever there are people who have no gospel access, or wherever the gospel access among a certain group of people is so small that those Christians cannot effectively proclaim the good news of Jesus on their own, to their own people, the Alliance wants to join them. So we come alongside people who have no gospel access, and we provide it from the outside. It can only come from the outside. The Alliance does this very holistically. We recognize that in many of the places we are trying to bring the good news, it's not just that they have no access to the living water of Jesus Christ, they have no access to water. Not only that they have no access to the great physician, they have no access to medical care. They have no access to God, the great and honorable and merciful and loving judge. There's also no justice. And so through common services and through marketplace ministries, the Alliance comes into communities and begins to provide for needs that then open the door for us to be able to present the good news of Jesus Christ. The Alliance is also in places like Berlin, Germany, and in former Eastern Germany, because former Eastern Germany is the most atheistic geographical region on earth. And the Alliance is there. People need to hear the good news. In Berlin, this is happening in several ways. My colleagues Jose and Melanie Chinchilla. Jose is Guatemalan by birth, now American through citizenship, and Jose is married to Melanie. They both speak fluent Spanish, but couldn't escape the idea that God was calling them to Berlin, Germany. So they came to Berlin and also learned German, and now God has opened up an amazing route of ministry for them to minister to many Spanish and Latin American immigrants that now call Berlin home as they start a Spanish-speaking international church in the city of Berlin. Jose is also an educator, and so he wants to see church leaders trained and raised up. And so Jose is also working on revitalizing an Alliance Bible Institute in Northeast Germany, looking to put together modular education to be able to train church leaders in 3 different languages: in Spanish, in German, and in Arabic. Other colleagues are Daryl and Cheryl Fennessy. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a few minutes. Daryl and Cheryl Fennessy are working with Arabic-speaking Muslims in the city of Berlin through the large immigrant movement that is now calling Berlin home. And then Don and Sarah Jones and their children and our family will be starting a new German-speaking church in Berlin when we return. The Alliance is so international in Germany. There are 2 Spanish-speaking churches, 2 Chinese-speaking churches, and there will soon be at least 4 Arabic-speaking churches, but only 2 German-speaking churches. And so the Alliance, the national church in Germany, has almost begged us, please come back and start a German-speaking church in the city of Berlin. We're also ministering, the Alliance is also ministering northwest of Berlin in a small city called Waren. And there the Carey family and Summer Hartzler and the Cole family are ministering through some really creative ways to build relationships through which they can share the gospel. They're doing a lot of English camps and English corners at cafes, cooking ministries, some children's ministries, and looking for some youth groups, looking for some great ways to share the good news. So the gospel access can only be created from the outside, but the Alliance, and really one of the reasons I felt passionate about joining the Alliance is because the Alliance is not colonial in the way it does missions. That we really believe that missions has to start from the outside, but it's not only for all peoples, but then eventually from all peoples. And our heart's prayer is that as people are reached, and bodies of Christians begin to meet together, as small groups develop into churches, and churches develop into networks of churches, that networks of churches begin to raise up their own church leaders, and as these church leaders grow, God begins to use the people that He has grown in ministry to send them to reach people from other nations as well. that eventually gospel access is sustained and multiplied from the inside. We have a neat way that this has happened in the ministry in Berlin. As I shared, there were 75,000 Syrian and other refugees that came to the city of Berlin in calendar year 2015 to 2016. Just for reference sake, Berlin is 3.7 million in the geographical boundaries of Berlin, and the suburbs around it 5.8. 75,000 refugees is a lot. And as these refugees started to come to the city of Berlin, we noticed that the German people were responding in amazing ways to reach the emergency needs of the people that were coming. But we began to be concerned about the long-term spiritual needs of the people that God was bringing in, and felt that there's two ways we can look at this situation. It's either a crisis or an amazing opportunity, because throughout the history of man, God always moves in people movements. And as this large group of people was moving and he was bringing them to our country, we began to feel, how can we impact their lives so that at the very least, they were reached for the gospel if they stayed here. But a best case scenario, that when and if the conflict in Syria comes to a close, we have the amazing opportunity to send Christians back into their home countries, in places where it's difficult for us to reach. We began working with common services, with a national church in Germany, with IM, and Daryl and Cheryl Fennessy, longtime missionaries, international workers in the Middle East, agreed to come and spend their last 2 years in Berlin. Daryl and Cheryl are amazing. They've started ministries everywhere they went. One of the ministries they started was a Bible college in Lebanon. And in this Bible college in Lebanon, they began training up Christian workers. And these Christian workers then began traveling throughout the Middle East to share the good news. 2 of these evangelists went to Syria. And when they came to Syria, they came to the village of a man whose name is Jairus. And Jairus became a follower of Christ. Then Jairus went to a Nazarene Bible college. And then Jairus eventually went to, of all places, Brazil. There were many refugees from his country being sent to Brazil. He wanted to go there to reach them. The refugees left Sao Paulo, and so he was looking for another place to minister. And the Alliance invited him to come and join us in the work that we're doing at the Lighthouse. The Lighthouse is this new ministry center that's been established to reach out to Syria, to Arabic-speaking Muslims in the city of Berlin. And Jairus and his wife Abir have now joined us. And so the gospel came for Jairus. And then Jairus was trained as a Christian worker. And now the gospel is coming from Jairus. Reached by Alliance workers in his home country, now reaching out to refugees from his home country. Jairus has just been invited to leave Berlin and then to move south in the country to pastor 3 churches that are Arabic-speaking small groups that are raising up to become churches in southwestern Germany. So please pray for Jairus and his family. The last thing I want to talk about this morning is this amazing promise that God gives us. So we can be peculiar people because there's this amazing provision, because God has given us a purpose, and also because God has given us a promise. And this promise is that God will show up while people may be saved. In verse 12, we read kind of an interesting verse. It says that, conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that in the case where they speak against you as those who do what is evil, they will, by observing your good works, glorify God on the day of visitation. So we don't use the word Gentiles very often anymore either. The root word there is the word for our word ethnic now. It really referred to people who weren't Jewish, the outsiders. But for me, the interesting words come at the end of this verse, that they will glorify God on the day of visitation. What does that mean? What does it mean that people who are observing us will change and begin to glorify God? In Acts chapter 15, a little bit of context here, there's a church council. The church is meeting together because Peter has gone to the house of a man named Cornelius, this Roman centurion. And this Roman centurion and his family have become followers of Christ. But the early church isn't quite sure what to do with this. They're not Jewish people. at first they're even upset with Peter for going into a non-Jewish person's home and eating with them. Peter explains the story, and the church says, well, maybe what we need to do is we need to say that before people become Christians, they need to first become Jewish. And so first Jewish, and then Christians. And Peter tells the story again about what God did. About how, as he was speaking, the people became followers of Christ, and how the Holy Spirit came and demonstrated that these are really my people now. And so James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the church, stands up and says, Simon Peter has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name. James says, guys, God showed up. We have nothing to argue about. But he uses this word, visits. The same word that now, years later, Peter uses as he's writing to the scattered sheep. He says there is a time, as we share the good news, as we talk about what God is doing, as we share what he's done for us, that he shows us. We can't force that to happen. Our goal isn't to make God come. That's God's job. Our job is to share. His job is to come. And sometimes this happens amazingly quickly. We share the good news like Mike and Doris did with Clara, Cafe Impulse. And she heard the good news, and the single mom in Berlin, Germany, gave her heart to Jesus, this amazing transformation. She heard, God showed up, she gave her life to him, and we were able to celebrate her baptism. Clara was a part of our small group. This amazing transformational story. And sometimes it takes a really long time. Like with Holger. Holger was raised in East Germany, amazingly intelligent. He's an architect, brilliant man, athletically gifted growing up. He would run into Christians now and then. Holger says, all the Christians I ran into, I kind of viewed as exotic. Not like Martian green men exotic, Holger says, but just strange, just different. And then Holger ran into or met a couple of our CNMA missionaries. They had kids close to the same age, lived in the same neighborhood. And this is what Holger wrote recently. He wrote, Christians cross our path. They're nice. They open their arms to us. They ask us to come with them to church, completely without obligation. Sure, it can't hurt anything. We start attending. Although they are younger than we are, they seem to be so mature, so serene, so confident. Why? And this begins to work on Holger. And over a process of 8 years, Holger comes to church off and on, attends camps, is in Bible studies, is part of new believers groups, and begins to step by step discover what it means to have faith in Jesus Christ. And after 8 years, Holger gave his life to Christ. And in this passage, Peter is telling us that when we live peculiar lives that are set apart as being God's own precious possession, that maybe cause us to also live lives that are different than the people around us. People notice. And when God shows up, they can give glory to him while the gospel is being proclaimed. Sadly, we know that not everyone will. Why verses like Philippians 2 or Romans 14 exist that tell us that one day when Jesus shows up, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. But our hope and our prayer is that for many this will happen before it's too late. What would it be like if we as a family of Alliance churches, an Acts 1:8 family of churches, really began to live as people who recognize God's provision? And live these amazingly priestly lives of purpose and believed God's promise. How would that impact how we live? How would that impact how we prayed, or how we interacted with our neighbors, or how we spent our money, or how we obeyed God's call to go, or how we as parents saw God calling our children and recognized his call to send them? How does that impact how we invest in knowing and praying for people of the world that lack gospel access? What changes in the way we think about, or talk about, or interact with our new neighbors from people of different cultures? How do we become people who are willing to be those who represent justice and serve others? Because kingdom people do things in peculiar ways. Some of you may feel that God is speaking to you this morning and saying, I want you to stop being so different with being peculiar. I want you to stop being uncomfortable with being different. And you know what God's calling you to do. Maybe he's calling you to give more, or to pray more, or to go, or to start a new ministry, or to be involved in an existing ministry. Don't leave this morning without cementing that decision. It might be as simple as writing it down or jotting it in the margin of your Bible in 1 Peter chapter 2. Or talking to one of the elders of the church. Or visiting with one of the pastors. Or coming and talking to me. Some of you know that God is calling you to go. And he's putting unmistakably on your heart the need to be involved in a lifetime of service for him. Don't put that off. When I was 12 years old, at a missions conference in an Alliance church, I committed my life to a lifetime of ministry for him. Because somebody else gave me the opportunity to respond to God's call for ministry. So I'm just paying it forward. God may be calling you this morning as well. I'm going to invite Pastor Orwell to come up and to close the service this morning. Let me just selfishly say, if you are a prayer and you would like to pray for our ministry, please, there are prayer cards in the back. Grab a prayer card. It's got my email address on it. You can email me with any questions or comments you have. Put it on your refrigerator and pray for me every time you grab a snack. Or put it on your bathroom mirror and pray for me whenever you're getting ready in the morning. Whatever prompts you to pray, please pray for our family as we serve. If you would like to get newsletters or regular updates, there's a list on the table back there. Just sign up on that, and we'll be happy to send you updates of what God is doing in our lives.
Thank you, Mike. This morning, we'd like to take a love offering from Mike and Alyssa Picconato. It's to show our appreciation for Mike's time with us, but more than that, it's to show our appreciation for the ministry that they are doing over in Germany. They've committed their lives to work over in Germany, and so this is a way of showing our appreciation for them. Let me pray for that offering. Father, we thank you for the work that Mike and Alyssa are doing in Berlin. And Father, we pray that you would continue to use them. And I pray that you would continue to enable them, empower them, and anoint them as they seek to reach the unreached through your kingdom. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Let me get out to Word of Life Church. If you're writing a check for Picconatos, take it out to Word of Life Church, and then we'll give them one check.